Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour. Merci d'être venus si nombreux à cette conférence au sujet de la politique étrangère américaine et l'élection présidentielle aux États-Unis. Cette conférence est présentée par le Centre d'études en politique internationale, CITE, le réseau en études de sécurité ici à l'Université d'Ottawa, en collaboration avec l'ambassade des États-Unis. Je m'appelle Alexandra Getchou, je suis la directrice associée du CITE. And it is my distinct pleasure and privilege to welcome all of you to what will undoubtedly be a very special event. Now, before going any further, I would like to gratefully acknowledge the financial support provided by the US Embassy and by Fulbright Canada. And I would also like to point out that this is a live stream, and we will be taking questions via Twitter. The hashtag is election2016. And I am told that we are being watched live from Duke University. So hello, North Carolina. Greetings from sunny Canada. We are delighted to have all of you with us, and please do not hesitate to share your thoughts via Twitter, or of course those of you who are in the room in present. Now, if I may paraphrase a famous writer, it is a universally acknowledged truth that the presidential race in the US has generated tremendous interest and passion in Canada and indeed around the world, especially in recent weeks. Canadians are watching this race with fascination, and many are asking questions about the extent to which and the ways in which its outcome may shape the role of the United States in the world. Now, today we are very fortunate to have with us two very distinguished foreign policy experts who are in a uniquely privileged position to address some of these questions. And they are Professors Peter Fever and Professor Bruce Gentleson, both of them from Duke University. A very warm welcome, and thank you so much for making time to be with us today. We are very grateful indeed. I am also delighted to say that our discussion will be moderated by Dick Custon, the Cultural Affairs Officer at the US Embassy in Canada, who, in addition to a very impressive career in the Foreign Service, was also an award-winning broadcast journalist for some 14 years. Across his 14. I want to be very clear on that, yes, 14. Now, across his Foreign Service career, Dick has served in South Africa, Poland, the UK, and Afghanistan. And prior to coming to Canada, he was posted in Washington, D.C. as Deputy Director of the Public Diplomacy Office in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce to you our moderator and invite him to take the floor and get us started. Can I just ask all of you to please join me in welcoming our panelists and thanking them for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. It is truly, truly a pleasure for me to be here because there has been no attention paid to this election whatsoever. You know, the United States Embassy and the United States government are very serious about supporting initiatives like this one, which help explain American policy and society and culture and values. And I think if there's anything that needs explaining, it might be these elections. So we're very grateful to have our two professors from Duke University here today. One thing I do want to add, though, is that the views that you will hear expressed here do not necessarily represent those of the U.S. government or the U.S. Embassy, so I have to be very careful about that. But I wanted to tell you, it's amazing the popularity of this particular topic. I have had people coming up to me left and right saying, we got to vote, we got to vote. I said, but you're Canadian. Yeah, and they say, no, it's that important. And it really is. I mean, this election is that important. It is an opportunity not only for the United States, but also for the world, and that's why the world is watching so closely. But the Center for International Policy Studies and the Embassy of the United States are pleased to welcome foreign policy experts Professor Bruce Gentleson and Professor Peter Fever of Duke University for a conversation in their popular Foreign Exchange YouTube series about American policy and politics. So without further ado, let's meet our guests. First, Bruce Gentleson. Bruce Gentleson is a professor of public policy and political science at Duke University, where he previously served as director of the Terry Sanford Institute, now the Sanford School of Public Policy. He's a leading scholar of American foreign policy and has served in a number of U.S. policy and political positions. In 2015 to 2016, he is the Henry A. Kissinger Chair in Foreign Policy and International Relations at the John W. Klug Center at the Library of Congress. He has authored or co-authored several books on U.S. foreign policy, and from 2009 to 2011, he was Senior Advisor to the U.S. State Department Policy Planning Director. In 2012, he served on the Obama 2012 campaign, a National Security Advisory Steering Committee. He has lectured internationally and is often quoted in the press. He has appeared on such shows as the Lehrer NewsHour, BBC, Al Hurrah, China Radio International, and National Public Radio. And he co-hosts the popular YouTube series Foreign Exchange with Professor Peter Feaver. He holds a PhD from Cornell University, a master's degree from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a bachelor's degree also from Cornell, including study at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. Peter Feaver. He is a professor of political science and public policy, also from Duke University. He is director of the Triangle Institute for Security Studies and also director of the Duke program in American Grand Strategy. From 2005 to 2007, Mr. Feaver was on leave to be special advisor for strategic planning and institutional reform on the National Security Council staff at the White House, where his responsibilities included the national security strategy, regional strategy reviews, and other political military issues. Mr. Feaver is author and co-author of several books and co-hosts the popular YouTube series, Foreign Exchange with Professor Gentleson. He has published numerous other monographs, scholarly articles, book chapters, and policy pieces on American foreign policy, public opinion, nuclear proliferation, civil-military relations, information warfare, and U.S. national security. He is a member of the Aspen Strategy Group and blogs at shadow.foreignpolicy.com. In 1993 to 94, Mr. Feaver served as Director for Defense Policy and Arms Control on the National Security Council at the White House, where his responsibilities included the National Security Strategy Review, counterproliferation policy, regional nuclear arms control, and other defense policy issues. So without further ado, let me start with Peter Feaver.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here. It's good to be on the couch with my friend and colleague, Bruce Gentleson. I must say I was a little bit surprised. I know how important the U.S.-Canadian relationship is, and so I thought the last thing we would want to do is to bring up the topic of the election, which would be painful for the audience. The only thing worse than that would be to bring a card-carrying Republican up here to do that. I hope the staff of the embassy will work overtime to repair whatever damage that I do. But I want to make a few general remarks about how foreign policy fits in the campaign, and then I'll drill down to 2016. The conventional wisdom is that foreign policy doesn't matter much in presidential campaigns, but the election matters a great deal for foreign policy. That's the conventional wisdom story. So when it comes to picking a president, it's chosen more on domestic policy matters. The famous aphorism from the 1992 campaign, "It's the economy, stupid," trying to focus then Governor Clinton just on talking about the economy, and that's how American voters pick their president. But then the conventional wisdom goes, once you have a president, it matters greatly what that choice is, because, of course, different perspectives, once they get into office, swing wildly in how America's direction goes. As a point of fact, the conventional wisdom is wrong as a general rule. In fact, foreign policy matters in the vote choice much more than that story I told you holds. Voters have to have a minimum level of comfort with the candidate on national security, even for the candidate to win. So for Governor Clinton in 1992, even though it's an economy-stupid election, he understood that he had to pass that minimum commander-in-chief threshold test, and tried very hard to do so, was in danger of falling below that, and was rescued at a crucial moment by retired Admiral Crow, who had served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Bush. And Crow got up and said, actually, even though I served with President Bush, I would prefer to have Clinton as commander-in-chief. And that was a powerful, validating moment that got Clinton over the commander-in-chief threshold test. So there's a minimum threshold you just have to pass. Remember this for when we get down to the 2016 election. But also, foreign policy issues can play a vital role in the perception of the two candidates. In 72, for instance, it's quite clear that there was a national security referendum, and the American people did not want the direction that was being offered by McGovern. Some would argue 1980 was a similar foreign policy choice election. 2004, the Iraq War was crucial. 2008, the Iraq War was crucial, although the vote went the other way. So foreign policy can matter a great deal in the voter's choice. Conversely, the conventional wisdom exaggerates the degree to which the presidential choice really matters. There's remarkably more continuity across across presidencies, even when the party changes hands. Now, if you just measure the rhetoric, you would think that it's a night and day switch. If you contrast, say, Governor Bush's rhetoric in the 2000 campaign, you would have thought he was going to come in and repeal everything that the Clinton administration stood for on national security. Likewise, then Senator Obama, repealing everything that President Bush stood for. But if you step back and look at the level of policy, there's remarkable continuity across those presidencies, Clinton to Bush to Obama. And on crucial aspects about how to conduct the war on terror, for instance, President Obama largely continued the policies he inherited from President Bush. Actually, I think this insight is easier to see when you're outside the country, and foreign nations look at what the U.S. is doing and says, boy, the words are different, but the policies sure look similar. And so continuity is usually more evident in fact than is realized in rhetoric. So my point is the conventional wisdom is actually an unreliable guide for assessing the role of foreign policy in elections and the role of elections in foreign policy over time. Except in 2016, okay? Now this might be the year that the conventional wisdom is right. In fact, many political scientists are suspecting that the most common phrase in PhD dissertations in the United States in about 20 years is going to be, except for 2016, comma, and then whatever general pattern we'll observe. This is a very different election, as you all can see. It's possible that the candidate will be chosen not on national security grounds or not on foreign policy grounds, but on some very different set of criteria. There are foreign policy issues in play in this campaign, but the one that is the most important is that threshold commander-in-chief test. If you watched the debate on Monday, there was very little policy debate, very little time where one of the candidates was arguing for one foreign policy position and the other candidate was arguing for the other foreign policy position. In fact, Trump, on several foreign policy matters, says, well, I might actually agree with Clinton on this narrow issue. What is important, what is vitally important in this campaign is the national security commander-in-chief threshold test. And this is important because for the first time in modern memory, the Republicans have nominated a candidate that many Republicans feel falls below the commander-in-chief threshold. And it's quite unprecedented. But a lot of senior Republican national security experts have actually come out publicly and said, in their judgment, this, at that point he was just a candidate and now the nominee of the party, does not meet that minimum threshold. And so I was one of the people who signed that statement in August. I signed an earlier version of it in March. And I was joined in August by about 50 other colleagues who had served at senior levels in previous Republican administrations. This is a remarkable shift. As a general rule, Republicans own national security as an issue. When voters are concerned about national security issues, then that helps Republican candidates as a general. They're fine people on the other side of the aisle working national security, but when the voters care about national security, historically they've favored Republicans. And so to have senior Republican national security specialists say that in their judgment the candidate falls below the threshold, that's quite striking. But beyond that, you don't see many foreign policy issues being debated at the level of policy. Now, I think later on in our conversation we'll get to that level, but it will be at a level that you haven't really heard in the general election so far. Likewise, one could argue that this is a case where if the election goes one way or the other, the foreign policy direction of the country will shift pretty significantly compared to previous elections. So the rhetoric about how this is the most important election in America of all time, you'll hear that every 4 years. And there's never been a presidential candidate who said, you know, it doesn't really matter this year. Whoever wins, I'm sure it'll all work out. So they never say that. But that rhetoric, I would argue, exaggerates the difference. I think this time you could get very different policies, particularly on issues that the Canadians care about. So it's entirely possible that a President Trump would carry through with his threat to leave NAFTA. If I had to bet, what he would do is actually start filing the motions to head in that direction and then seek to renegotiate a bilateral sweetener that would stop it, but sort of basically jam Canadians and the Mexican government to make concessions. But if they don't, then move out. And that's something that the last president talked about doing. So President Obama campaigned and said he was going to renegotiate NAFTA, but everybody understood that was nonsense. And indeed, someone from his campaign at a session this came up and said, don't worry, he's not that stupid. And that person lost his job. So watch how carefully my friend tiptoes and dances whenever you ask a really tough question. This time around, I think it could be different. And so there are issues like that where I could imagine a President Trump moving in a very different direction. So that leads me to the next point. How should Republicans think about this election? Republicans like myself, people with an interest in national security, have fallen into several different baskets. And I'll just explain briefly the logic that they get. There's one basket, and this is the one I fell in, is that we look at the Republican nominee and we say, we had 14 others that would have been wonderful candidates. They each had different strengths and weaknesses, but on national security we could have endorsed them, and the party picked the one that we couldn't. And so we refused, and we publicly come out and state we will not support Trump, and I won't vote for Trump in November. There's another basket of Republicans who make that same logical progression and conclude, therefore, I need to endorse Secretary Clinton. She has a lot of strengths, and compared to Trump, she's obviously prepared on the issues. She has relevant expertise. And while there may be issues that people do not like about her on this or that policy, compared to Trump, my friends conclude she is the superior choice, and so they endorse her. And there's a number of very prominent Republicans who have done so, and there's more coming out every week. And then there's a third category of people who I think are sympathetic in their critique of Trump, but have not come out publicly one way or the other. How could you end up in each of those baskets? Well, I've explained the logic for the first. Let me tell you why I'm not in the second basket. Those who go all the way across the aisle to endorse Clinton are making it harder for them to have a role in repairing whatever is left of the Republican Party after this election. There's going to be a debate inside the party of the heart and soul of the party, what the party stands for. This country, the United States, needs a strong Republican Party. The Democratic Party, when they're in power and they don't have a strong Republican voice in the opposition, things tend to go poorly for the country. So there are system benefits when there's a strong check and balance. And so repairing the Republican Party strikes me as not just a partisan interest, but is actually in the national interest. But Republicans who have endorsed Secretary Clinton will find it hard to contribute at the level that needs to be contributed to that repairing the Republican Party. And so I think that is why many people have not joined my friends who have taken the principled position of endorsing Clinton. What about that third category? People who are not making a public statement one way or the other. Well, the logic there is Trump might win. That may have sounded like a punchline 6 months ago. I noticed no one laughed when I said that now. Secretary Clinton is a markedly weak candidate for president. She has the highest negatives of any successful candidate for president. If she becomes president, she will have won she will be the most unpopular president on day one that we've had. The only nominee more unpopular than her in the polls is the one she's facing, Trump. So she may still win, but she has very high negatives, and so she could lose. She has a number of issues where the positions she took or the record she has deeply problematic, and so much so that almost any other Republican would have been very able to put her on the defensive in debates. It's also the case that she's stuck with a record that is very hard to defend. Now you're going to see a master tiptoe and tap dance around to defend it, but what he will be unable to rebut is the fact that the country, in international relations terms, geostrategic terms, is in worse shape today than when Obama took office. And so the Obama administration, in geostrategic terms, drove the country into the ditch, and now she's campaigning to be asked to be given the keys to the car for another 4 years. That's a very tough argument to make, and it's entirely possible that she would fall short and not win the election. It's also possible to imagine surprises between now and November. We can all come up with them. It's hard to come up with surprises that would help her. It's much easier to come up with surprises that would help him. So that means there's a real chance, at least a big enough chance that it's worth planning for a President Trump. In that case, it's in the country's interests that he have the best advisory team that he can have. People like myself are disqualified. We've come out publicly and said we would not vote for him. People like my friends who've endorsed Clinton have made themselves even more unemployable in a Trump administration. And I think you all, as global citizens who will be affected by whatever the U.S. does in the next 4 years, it's in your interest that some of the finest national security team that is available to Trump. And so I am glad that some of my friends, even though they might share some of my critique of Trump, have not come out publicly and have made themselves available to serve should Trump be elected. So I think that's why people fall in the different baskets. But then, and this is my last word before I hand it over to Bruce, there is a fourth basket, and I think some of my friends thought I might be in that fourth basket. And that's the people who are coming north shopping for real estate. I just want to tell you, this is a beautiful city, and I'm impressed by the weather. It's just remarkable. I don't know why you all complain about it, because it's really quite lovely. But no, I'm not shopping for real estate here.
Thank you.
Bruce, before we get started, I'm just wondering if we should put chairs on the stage in case you want to throw any, or if between the two of you. I just want to make sure.
Yeah. Now I've got to work my way out of that ditch first. I'll figure that out. First of all, let me thank Stephanie and Alexandra and the university and the center and the American Embassy for inviting us here. It's a great opportunity to have this kind of dialogue here in Canada as well as we have it back in the U.S. And let me say that, as Peter said, you know, we're friends. I don't have any friend who I consider a good friend who's wrong as much as he is, but we're friends. In fact, in 2012 we did this. We did some dueling op-eds for foreignpolicy.com. And then we did one in the local newspaper, the Raleigh News and Observer. And he gets this irate email or call for somebody that's, you know, just calling him out as an immoral person and everything else. And this, I guess this goes on for a while. And he finally emails me and forwards it to me because he'd made a bet with the guy that if you know, he could demonstrate that people considered him a good person.
I had to find one person who considered him.
That's right. The guy would contribute to his favorite charity. So he called upon me, the dueling op-ed, and I told the guy, you know, he's wrong a lot, but he really is a good guy. So we got a donation to whatever his favorite charity was, I think, from the guy if he delivered. So let me make a couple of comments. Some are, I guess, some agreement, but I also want to sort of just set the context, talk about a couple issues, but I think you guys will ask about a lot of specific issues. First point, I think, is what Peter said about the question about foreign policy matters. And it really does matter a lot in this election. And for many of the reasons that he said, for some I kind of want to add on to, more than I think many other elections. It's true it's been out there. It's not the case it's always been a Republican issue. If you looked at the polls in 2012, Obama did better than Romney on who do you favor on national security. So it's been in a bit of fluctuation, frankly, since the Iraq War. But there was a period coming out of Vietnam where it really was a heavily Republican issue. But the reason it matters is you see polls, and I've got some data here that I wanted to use. So 2011, December 2011, a year before the 2012 presidential election, when people were asked what's the most important problem facing the country, only 6% named international issues, right? In December 2014, right after our midterm congressional elections, it was 9%. In December 2015, you know, getting into this election year, after things like San Bernardino, it was up to 32%. And a couple of months ago, USA Today did a poll, and it came out about 23%. So jobs in the economy was higher, but they were the only two issues that were up there in double digits. You don't have to be the most important issue, especially in a close race, you know, to make the marginal difference. And I think that's going to stay that way. And I think that it's both specific issues, but it's also this broader notion of commander-in-chief, or more broadly, you know, who do I think handles the country's interests? And so we haven't seen numbers like that really in a long, long time. I think 1980 we probably would have seen them, you know, in the wake of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the American hostages in Iran. Second point is, and here I think I'm going to differ a bit, is the sharp differences between the candidates and the parties. So Trump is a more extreme version of some broader differences. I mean, for example, on polls about, and these are actually taken from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which does a lot of great polling. In fact, we both serve on their advisory committee. Is Islamic fundamentalism a critical threat? 75% of Republicans, yes. 49% of Democrats, yes. Use of torture against suspected terrorists, 64% Republicans, yes, 33% Democrats. Immigration, a threat from large numbers, not even specifying illegals in this question, 67% Republicans, yes, 27% Democrats. This wall in Mexico, the Rio Grande, 79%, 28%. Climate change, flip it, 57% Democrats, yes, it's a critical threat, 18% Republicans. So we're seeing, I think, a significant difference in the parties. And it's not just Trump. You know, I think Ted Cruz was pretty close in his candidacy. And even if you look at what's happened in Congress, so when there was the vote last summer, 2 summers ago, on the Iran nuclear deal, every single Republican in the House and the Senate voted against it. Now, you know the difference between our systems. Party unity, you know, is not inherent in the American political system. At the same time, a number of Republican luminaries, Colin Powell, Brent Scowcroft, national security advisor to 2 presidents, President Ford and George H.W. Bush, Senator Richard Lugar, conservative but chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for many years till he lost his seat, all supported it. So what you've been seeing in the Republican Party is, in many respects, a squeezing of what used to be called the Republican internationalist wing. There wasn't a single one of those 14 or 15 candidates, in my view, who, you know, was an internationalist in that traditional Republican sense. Trump takes this further. He's not an isolationist. Rand Paul sort of started that way, and he was actually the first guy to be knocked out. To me, an isolationist is somebody who says, let's just get out of world affairs, right? Trump's is different. You know, he wants to not just pull back, but he wants to kind of externalize the costs, right? We'll do this if you pay us more money, you know, NATO, Japan, South Korea. We're going to build a wall and you're going to pay for it. And, you know, it's sort of a bullyism in foreign policy that is highly aggressively nationalist, but it's not necessarily just coming home, it's making others, you know, hitting others along the way. I was giving a series of talks like this in Spain in February when Trump was first rising, and the word in Spanish for bully is matón. And I think that matonismo has much better ring than bullyism, so I've been calling it matonismo. Hillary Clinton, by the decision to run as Secretary Clinton rather than Senator Clinton, from the get-go she felt that she wanted to emphasize foreign policy more in her campaign, and also B, that it was a bit more prestigious. You know, she sort of falls in what in the policy world and the academic world is called liberal internationalists, with a more hawkish tint than President Obama. You know, on issues like Syria, for example, she's on record of having pushed a bit more for combining various kinds of military action and coercion with diplomacy. I think the TPP, the trade issue, is somewhat of an exception to what we think of liberal internationalists, but I want to say, you know, a word about that in a second. And so you see big differences among the parties. Trump is both a manifestation of these trends in the Republican Party and an exacerbation of them, but he didn't invent them. He just figured out how to tap them and take them to the next decibel. You know, his effect, as he might say, has been huge, but there were things to work with there. The last 2 points I'm making, one is the sense of the historical moment that we're in, and that's another reason why I think why people around the world are paying attention and Americans are paying attention. I mean, you think about where we are in this moment in history. You know, we're a quarter century since the end of the Cold War, and it's fair to say that the end of the Cold War has not yet been worked out, whether it's the policies of Putin or a whole variety of other issues that relate to the end of the Cold War. We know what happened at the end of the Cold War, but I think historically that's still playing itself out in global geopolitics. We're in the era of globalization, which, you know, the columnist Tom Friedman used to call it the, you know, the golden straitjacket. Like, it's a really good thing, and, you know, the golden arches theory of conflict, 2 countries that have McDonald's don't fight each other. And I think what we've seen is the cumulative effect, because this is not just the United States, right? I was in London in late June giving a talk on foreign policy in the American election. It turned out to be 2 days after Brexit. And I just sort of said, you guys tell me what's going on over here, you know. And then later that week, they proceeded to lose to Iceland in the European Cup. So, you know, people in Britain, in England at least, were pretty devastated. So the whole globalization impact, you're seeing it on the left and the right. The demographics of Trump voters and Bernie Sanders voters has some overlap. They differ about where to take it, obviously, in policy terms. You know, you see it in the rise of the left wing in many countries in Europe, Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain, and the right-wing groups all over Europe. And so, this era of globalization is swirling around us, as a second broad force along with the end of the Cold War. 9/11 in the year of terrorism. It's true that terrorism was going on before that, not just for Americans but elsewhere, but it really dramatically changed it. And now that we're in the, whatever you want to call it, the lone wolf actors, as you all had the attack on your parliament, and the dynamics of terrorism are part of this context on top of the others, and the rise of China, right? Economically, regionally, geopolitically. So all these things are swirling around, changing the context of foreign policy. I have some criticisms of the Obama administration. We can talk about them. I don't think we're in a ditch, and I don't think on balance has been a failure. I think it's had many successes, and as Peter knows and others know, while the Bush administration got criticized for some things that it did better than it was given credit for, the invasion of Iraq, in my mind, was one of the greatest blunders in the history of American foreign policy. So I think there's a lot to talk about there about what the legacy is coming forward. Last point I want to make is this question about Commander-in-Chief and the concerns about Trump as an individual. For the sake of argument, let's just say, he's a man who likes to make a deal, and he would come into office as president, and he would just change his positions. Let me negotiate a little harder on NAFTA, get a better deal. Europeans, just pay me a little more money, and we'll keep working together. Putin, I might have said nice things about you before, but I really don't like you. There can only be one tough guy in this world. Let's just say he does all that, right? The concern I think that people have is this notion that keeps getting talked about as temperament, right? One of the biographies of Franklin Roosevelt was called The First Class Temperament. When you think about decision-making, we have a colleague in this room who does a lot of work on decision-making in foreign policy. Or if the average American thinks about it in their own life, personal or their own work life, when you make decisions impetuously and emotionally and not paying a lot of attention to what information or evidence you have, you tend to make bad decisions. And I think that's the crucial factor about Trump is, and if you look at his biography, there's a really good documentary that's just been released on American PBS about both of them called The Choice. I think it's available by stream. You see this thread all the way through his life, the way he's conducted himself, the way he makes decisions. And I just think it's not just the nuclear button, that's really itself and a metaphor. But I think people's concern, and this was reinforced in the debate the other night, by the screenshot, and having worked for Al Gore when he ran for president in 2000, and having seen in the lead up to this replays of his sighing when George Bush was talking, that led people, it was interesting at the time, the spin room that night said Gore won. But as the sigh kicked in, Gore lost the debate. He was being arrogant. It was reinforcing this notion that people had that he was, a little, always thought he was the smartest guy in the room, et cetera. Trump's visual, probably a lot of you saw it, I think, was really profound. And I'm sure his handler said, cool it, Donald, and he just couldn't do it. And so the temperament issue, I think, ultimately is the disqualifier in a very, very dangerous way because of, again, as we think about any kinds of decisions. There wasn't a lot of policy in that debate, so these things came through more. One of the debates remaining, if it does happen, is 90 minutes on foreign policy. So you're going to have to get into issues. Now, the candidates always deflect and all that sort of thing, but we will get into that in 90 minutes on domestic policy and the other debates. So, so I think there's a very clear choice there, and I think that, but separate from that, if Hillary Clinton wins, these forces that, we're talking about, of economic dislocation and cultural anxiety, we're going to be a majority-minority country within about a decade, and personal security of terrorism. And again, you see them, probably see them here, but I think in Canada less than any advanced Western industrial democracy I can think of. You see them all over Europe. Those are still going to be with us. And so she surely will have this issue of trying to up her popularity because of views of her, which I actually think is a manageable issue. But fundamentally, there's a lot going on in our societies now that are deep social forces that affect not only what we do at home, but the kind of role we play in the world. So that's the kind of cusp we're at. Obviously, who wins really matters. But I think beyond that, there's some things there that are, it's not just about who wins the election. Okay.
Thank you both very much. Before we go to the audience with questions, just one thing that you had touched on, Bruce, and I wanted you to discuss it just a little bit more because we tend to skew young in this audience. Obviously, we're on the university campus here. What effect do demographics have, this particular election, and particularly the youth vote? Previously, there have been difficulties getting that youth vote out and making sure that they felt like they were invested in this election, invested in democracy and so forth. What is the case this time? Is it important? Is it critical to the elections?
So we get about 58% of registered voters that vote in our presidential election. Okay, that's just and in our midterm congressional elections, it's like 36, right? World's greatest democracy, you know, not exactly what you want. And the 18 to 25 demographic, and in fact, across countries, you know, in the Brexit vote, they were the ones who wanted a do-over. You know, I didn't vote, and I really liked being in the EU, oops, but they didn't turn out there. So it's a problem. And it has been a problem for Hillary Clinton. You know, at one point, during the primary, 60% of women under 30 favored Bernie Sanders. And it was a really interesting dynamic, you know, and he wasn't exactly, you know, telegenic or anything else, but there is this sense with the vote. People are saying 1 in 3 people under 18 to 25 now are leaning towards the two, you know, the Libertarian candidate and the Green Party candidate. And again, in our system, it's really about the two candidates. So I think that's a major effort on her part, is to get those people out. Because we live in North Carolina. In 2008, it voted for Obama. In 2012, it did not. Beyond the youth, there's the African-American vote, the Hispanic vote. But Hillary Clinton only wins that state if she gets all of those constituencies out. And, you know, having lived through, with great pain, the 2000 election, and all these people I knew said, there's no difference between the two candidates, I'm going to go vote for Ralph Nader. I kind of lose my cool when people tell me that there's no difference between the candidates and they're going to vote for Gary Johnson or something. You know, I think I understand expressing your view, and I understand supporting Bernie Sanders and all that, but I think at the end of the day, you really need to know that you know, you can express your view, but it may have a tangible impact.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, this is one of the ways in which Clinton is a weak candidate. So this is a change electorate. The mood in the country favors change, and she is the establishment continuation candidate. More to the point, this is the last election, probably, when two baby boomers will be vying with each other. This is a passing of a political age, and the baby boomers have dominated American politics for the last 30 plus years, but this is their swan song. And there's a sense of disconnect between that generation and the 18 to graphic you mentioned. And then finally, and this is probably unfair to her, but it's a reality that her campaign has to deal with, there's a genuine Clinton fatigue in the country. There's a sense, just in today, the Washington Post ran a front page story dragging up all of the marital infidelity stories of the 90s, and it's a story that Americans have been, you know, listening to for decades, and folks are tired of it. And of course, that's not Secretary Clinton's fault. That's a critique of her husband. But I think, I'm sure Bruce has talked to many students who have that same kind of, I'm just tired of hearing that. I'd love to see something fresh. Now, Trump is older than her, and so and is a throwback to the 80s in so many ways, but he is different, and I think there's some people that difference appeal. At least he's not more of the same. And during the 30 minutes of the debate, when he was holding his own the first 30 minutes. He was holding his own because he kept harping at, you've been doing this for 30 years, you've been doing this for 30 years, you know, harping at, you're the old and I'll bring about change. So she and her team need to mobilize the youth vote and need to get them out to win key battleground states, particularly North Carolina, where it will matter heavily. Or she just might not win. And it would be ironic in the extreme if the youth vote, which is at odds with Trump on many, many policies, but by virtue of not voting or voting for another candidate, ends up swinging the election.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure we have many other questions, many other areas we want to go into, and I'd ask you to just raise your hand and then walk over to the microphone over here so that we can get you on mic and on camera. I should mention that this is being live streamed. So we have our first question over here.
Hello, thank you for coming and for the great talk. We really appreciate it. My name is David. I'm a student here in Public Administration and Political Science. I just had a quick question. I feel something we do not really talk about in these elections, and that might affect perhaps the outcome in maybe 2, 4, 6 years, is how Congress will shape up and how that's important as well. So I'd like to know and hear your thoughts about what if it's a more Republican-led Congress or a more Democratic-led Congress, depending on who wins. So, and how could that affect perhaps the president's influence afterwards? Thank you.
So, from a Republican point of view, it's a world of difference which President Clinton we have. President Clinton, who must negotiate with Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Schumer from New York, 2 Democrats, that is a very different presidency than President Clinton, who must negotiate and compromise with Speaker of the House Ryan and Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. And from a Republican point of view, that second world is much more favorable. That there are many things that a president can do just by executive authority, and we've seen with President Obama just how far you can go with executive authority. He's used the executive powers more than any other president in my lifetime. But the Congress is a break. And so a Republican Congress negotiating with a Clinton White House would feel very different than the Democrats controlling all 3 branches. And there was a time in August when it looked like that she might have a chance of not only winning the White House, Democrats winning the White House, winning the Senate, which was a very real possibility, but maybe even having such a decisive victory that they would win the House, which would take a landslide for that to happen. That looks less likely today. The Republicans, first of all, Trump has recovered ground, but secondly, down-ballot Republicans are outpacing Trump, particularly in key states where the Senate might be in play or where some House seats might be in play. So if you had to just bet, if you took a snapshot of what the betting markets say today, they would say it'll be a Democratic-controlled White House and a Republican-controlled Congress. That's a better outcome from a Republican point of view. It's not a better outcome if it leads to gridlock and dysfunction, as we've seen in the past. But here's where Clinton might be different. She might be more adept at negotiating with Congress than President Obama has been. President Obama has not been effective at negotiating with Republican-controlled Congress. And I think if she continues that pattern, then we'll have the gridlock we've had. But if she is better at negotiating and compromise, I think you could see a different outcome. Bruce.
Yeah, on the outcome, I think it's pretty certain it'll be a Republican House. And part of it is, we were talking with Stephanie earlier about the gerrymandering, the way districts are drawn. So the Republicans had gained control of state legislatures and governorships at a crucial time after the last sentence. I'll give you an example. Before the changing of the lines of the districts in North Carolina, we have 13 members of the House, and it was like 8 Democrats and 5 Republicans. The next election, with the newly drawn lines by the Republican governor and state legislature, it was 9 Republicans and 4 Democrats, but the aggregate vote for the House was 51% Democrat. Okay? So that's really part of the issue. So I think it's highly unlikely. Maybe the Democrats will gain some. The Senate, Peter's right. I mean, there was a period where, so I think that if she's president, the Democrats need to win 4 seats they don't currently hold. And there was a period coming out of the convention, which had been seen as enormously successful. I mean, one incredible speaker after another, validating her and pushing for turnout. And we are getting, I mean, because of North Carolina, Hillary Clinton's first appearance after the debate was in there. Chelsea's been down. Michelle Obama comes down. The president's coming down. There was a sense that you could get enough seats, you get 1/3 of the members every 2 years, that you'd be in a strong enough position in 2018 that you could still keep the majority because you'd have more people who are running, in vulnerability. I think people are more worried about that. I think there's some sense they can still get a small majority, and it's going back and forth. They only have 1 or 2 seats that they hold now that are currently vulnerable, and they're more Republican. The problem is that because some of the very big donors for the party, Republican Party, are not donating to Trump, names you might know like the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson, they put all their money into the Senate races. And my son is involved in this. He works in the Senate, and his mood went from, this is going to be great, to when I saw him a couple weeks ago, I don't know if this is going to work. He works for a Democratic Senate, powerful Democratic Senate. And but the other point, I think, is this question of what happens with, let's just say it's either fully Republican or split. People say that when Hillary Clinton became senator, she got a lot of praise from her Republican colleagues about her willingness to work across the aisle. So which Hillary Clinton you see? Is it the first lady in the vast right-wing conspiracy, or is it the senator from New York who worked pretty well with John McCain, with Lindsey Graham, with a whole variety of people? The Republican challenge, I think, is, given everything that's happened, do you stick to this same lockstep party unity, heavily, Tea Party-ish? Is that working for you, right? Is that working for you as Republicans? And again, it's very untypical of our political system. Or do you begin to have a little bit more flexibility in it? If you're Paul Ryan, on the one hand, you worry about the Tea Party types getting rid of you like they did your predecessor. On the other hand, if he sees himself as a statesman and a future leader of the party and presidential candidate, what are his interests in trying to strike certain deals with the President Hillary Clinton? So I think both parties have, decisions to make about how they play it out. I think if the Republicans go back to their, Mitch McConnell, the first year Obama was president, then the Senate Minority Leader said, my, greatest goal is to make sure that he's a one-term president. Well, that didn't work, and you may have what some people call a third Obama term. So it'll be very interesting to see how both sides figure out their strategy.
I know we have a lot of questions, so we'll get right to the next one.
Hi, my name is Alan Freeman. I'm an honorary senior fellow here at the graduate school. I have a question for Professor Fever. I must admit, I'm a little perplexed with your basket. You're basically, from what I understand, in the basket which says you don't think Trump is up to it as commander-in-chief, but you won't support Hillary. In that way, it seems as if you're risking a Trump victory. In that case, if Trump wins, can you reform the Republican Party? And I have a second sort of minor question to the two of you. Do you think the Miss Universe pageant is under the rubric of foreign policy?
Well, Bruce is the expert on beauty pageants, so I'll let him handle that question.
Is that on my resume?
Yeah.
I never saw it. That's right.
They're both judges, by the way, for Miss Universe. I don't know if you know that. Yes.
So I've actually explained this in a blog post that I encourage you all to read on shadow government. I forget the title that the editors gave us, something like "Never Trump and Neither Clinton" or something like that. But it lays out the argument. We haven't really talked. You'll notice he's avoided talking about Secretary Clinton's record, and there's a reason why he's avoiding that topic. But she has a problematic record on substance where she was right on policy. And she was right on policy a number of times. She was not influential, unable to persuade Obama. Where she was influential and able to persuade Obama, it didn't go well on policy. So Libya would be a classic example where she was clearly influential in shaping the policy, and of course, the Libya operation did not go well. So as a record goes, it's a difficult record, but also presidencies are more than just foreign policy. There's also domestic policy, there's Supreme Court choices. It's troubling to me, and I say this as someone, the Clinton campaign has, of course, reached out to me and people like me, wooing us, trying to get us to endorse her, and of course, I think they have excellent people advising her, and so if she becomes president, some very, very fine Americans are going to go in and serve the country, and I respect them. But in this wooing, they offer nothing. They don't say that she's going to modulate a policy in any way to appeal to Republicans. She won't even say that she will renominate for the Supreme Court the nominee that President Obama has nominated. And the reason is, if she wins, she's going to, and she gets a Democratic Senate, she'll nominate someone far to the left. He's, of course, to the left of what Republicans would like to see. But he's better than some of the candidates that the Democrats might choose to nominate. She won't even make that concession. And so, from a point of view where you care about a wide spectrum of issues, you could say this is a problematic issue. And then the final argument is there's lots of wonderful Republicans. The Republican bench is much better, frankly, than the Democratic bench. One of the challenges that the Republicans had is they nominated they had so many strong candidates run in 2016 that they kind of defeated each other. But I intend to vote for Senator Ben Sasse, who's a very promising up-and-coming Republican. Maybe 2016 is obviously too soon for him. 2020, who knows, too soon. But remember that name. He's going to be a leader, Ben Sasse, and he's a fine American. And so part of it is a vote for the future.
So you think you can reform the Republican Party with a President Trump? That's what you're saying.
Well, I think if there is a President Trump, then the challenge for the Republican Party is much greater. I accept that proposition. I do. And that's why I've said I'm not voting for Trump.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to hear you talk about the beauty contest.
Yeah, right. Well, let me simply say we never entered our daughter in any beauty contest. She has a PhD and she went a different route, so we're not unhappy with that. The notion that he actually said things along the way when asked about his foreign policy credentials that I ran Miss Universe, that's like really weird, right? Candidates said, and he said it more than once. It wasn't just a gap. Of course, I'm happy to talk about the record. And I'll wait for a lot of questions, but I'll throw a couple things back to start to demonstrate that it's not being avoided. It just hasn't been asked yet. But since you raised it, the Libya intervention was the right thing to do. We went through the UN process the way you were supposed to do with the Arab League and the Security Council, including the Russians and the Chinese abstaining, not vetoing. Worked with the NATO partners. The mistake, was lack of follow-through. And there's a fundamental issue there. And absolutely everybody in the administration and the UN and Europe bears responsibility because it's not just, it's sometimes the way we think about terrorism, this, you eliminate a leader. The whole question of the follow-through. And there are a number of people here at this university and in fact, Canadian academics are some of the leaders in studying, this whole question of, how do you try to help states build capacity and stuff. But whatever else has gone wrong with Russia, we did get the START agreement, which was a big deal. That was part of the reset that was successful. The Iran deal in which Secretary Clinton and her staff that's still with her, played a crucial role. Of course, if you think the Iran deal was a bad deal, you see that differently. I don't. And we can go on and on with a bunch of other issues. And I think that, she left the secretaryship with about 60-some-odd% approval. The question of, and I do agree with some of the things that Peter was saying. There was a sense of the email and some of these other things, and people started to say, the Clintons are back with their political shenanigans. And so we got back into this, and, but I think there was enormous respect for the way she handled that position. On some of these pledges to Republicans, I actually think she will bring in, on the foreign policy and security side, more than a token Republican. And I think on the Judge Garland thing, how can Republicans say that when, in an unprecedented way, we have stalled the process and not created a ninth, allowed there to be a ninth Supreme Court justice. And if she were to be president and choose somebody else, well, Mitch McConnell, that's on your docket, because you didn't allow a hearing on the president's nominee, and that's a fundamental part of the system that should not be as vulnerable. They changed the Senate rules a couple years ago. Senator Harry Reid did, to limit the use of the filibuster on certain kinds of appointments, not fully, but this was one that it didn't apply to, and so there's a whole lot of responsibility on the Republican side.
Okay, next question.
Hey, my name is Amit, and I'm a law student. My question is about TPP. As the Secretary of State, she called TPP as the gold standard for all trade deals. But as a candidate, she has been campaigning against it. Do you think she flip-flopped because of the pressure from Bernie Sanders voters, or do you think she's changed fundamentally as a person?
Yeah, no, the change came during the Sanders challenge, no question. It's not my issue expertise, but I think, the Sanders challenge was there. And so the official position, as she stated the other night, was, well, it was the gold standard based upon where it was going, and then it changed. But I think this really gets at this broader issue. We've taught it in our classes. We've had this very dichotomous debate for a long time. You're either free trade or you're a protectionist. And what we are seeing, again, without in any way agreeing with the Brexit vote, is there's this range of policy options, coming out with what do we mean by fair trade? How do you really ensure? When I teach trade policy politics in my class, I say, my Subaru costs less money. The aggregate benefits to the economy, but the guy in, General Motors worker in Michigan or a factory plant in North Carolina, they bear very heavy direct costs, so the aggregate cost. But even economists now, MIT economists and others, are beginning to challenge sort of the free trade orthodoxy. I think we need to rethink this, It may be addressed in the so-called lame duck session. The Senate did approve fast track, but if it fails, in that period, it will be because both Republicans and Democrats are not prepared to vote for it. So I don't know enough of the details about TPP, but if we move on to TTIP and all these other trade deals, I think that's the message we're seeing, is that globalization, the distribution of costs and benefits, we've got to work on that, which doesn't mean you go protectionist, but you find positions that are not just sort of the church of free trade orthodoxy.
I do think TPP illustrates a challenge that she has. If you want to stump a Clinton staffer, ask them to list the top 3 achievements that she had as Secretary of State. I've done this, and it's a cruel treatment to people to make them do this on live TV, so I would never do it to my friend Bruce Jennelson. But before she did that change of position, they would have said the Asia pivot. Her article on the pivot to Asia laid out the conceptual framework for it, and while it's clear that President Obama bought into the notion of disinvesting from the Middle East, she laid the conceptual framework for the heavy investment on Asia. But it's hard to have a pivot to Asia without TPP. And so this is the challenge. When she went against TPP for very understandable reasons from a political science point of view, you can explain why. She was in the fight of her life from the left, and she felt she had to cave on that issue or she would lose the primary. And now she's stuck defending that position, and she can't move back to the center because she's running against a candidate who is even more reflexively opposed to the TPP. And one of the few points when he scored on her on Monday night was saying, trust her, trust me, she's going to change her position, which of course causes her to double down and say, by golly, there's no chance I'm going to do the right thing when I'm president. Of course I'm not going to change my position. So she's being, driven further and further to the left on this issue. But in doing so, it puts in jeopardy whatever good the pivot to Asia was able to accomplish. And so I think it's a big challenge. As Bruce mentioned when he's quoting statistics, the mood of the Republican voter has shifted. And so Republicans used to be pro-free trade. less so now. I think part of it is a reflexive anti-Obama. If Obama is for it, then I must be against it, whatever that is. And so I think that explains some of the shift. I think it also, there's this sense that that Trump is playing into, that these trade deals haven't benefited America as much as were promised. But the reason for that trade deal is not just its economic pro or con, but it's the larger strategic framework that sets for Asia, which is very important for the future of Asian security. And so if they are unable to get it during the lame duck session, and Bruce is more optimistic than I am that they'll be able to get it then. If they're unable to, she's going to have a real challenge, because she can't go back to the countries and get a better deal. The countries have already made it clear that they've made some painful concessions that they're paying a political price for now, and they're not going to make further concessions. And so she'll be left with, do I support this deal or not? Do I just accept a big flip-flop? It's hard, but I think that's what she'll do, and my precedent for that is her husband on MFN for China. So go back and look at how he campaigned in '92 and then what he actually did in '93, '94. So I think at the end of the day, that's what she will do, but it'll be wrenching and painful for her, and she'll pay a political price.
Yeah, I would just add one thing. I think that, with the NAFTA model, which only got through because of these side agreements on environmental issues and labor standards, there may be something like that you can do, with TPP or rebranding and that doesn't necessarily require renegotiation, that could give you, a possible way of moving on. Again, people who know the issue know, but I think there are options there that are not just, A or B.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Hello, I'm Tyler Brooks. I'm a first-year student here, and I think on behalf of everybody here, we really thank you for coming here. It's really awesome that you guys come up here and talk to us about all this. Since the theme here is international policy, one of the things I like to look at is the Middle East, and I think that's a very big problem, or it's a big situation right now. And I just want both your opinions, if that's all right, on which presidential candidate do you think would work better with Israel? Because I think under the Obama administration, they kind of had a hot and cold relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu. And yeah, I just want to know your opinion. Who do you think would work better with Israel to try to resolve the crisis at hand?
So I'll give a short answer, and Bruce can give a longer answer. You asked two questions: who can work better with Netanyahu, and who can work better with Israel? So, and those they may not be the same candidate, same answer. So I think Netanyahu would be very adept at relating to President Trump, so I don't think that the personal relationship would suffer much between a Trump and a Netanyahu. But if you elevate the issue to say, well, the long term, it may not be Prime Minister Netanyahu, as parties shift, who over the long term can work with the government of Israel, and I think that a Clinton administration would handle that rather adeptly. There's a lot of baggage from the Obama administration. The Obama administration grossly mishandled the relations with Israel, particularly in the first 2 years. They came in with a wrong-headed idea, and they are threatening to bookend that with a disastrous turn in the UN Security Council. They're with a possible move. That would be bad. But I think a Clinton administration would repair some of that damage.
So I've worked on the Middle East issues a lot, both in government and outside. And I think that the criticism of Obama has a lot of inaccuracy in it. We just signed a 10-year largest military and intelligence assistance deal with Israel ever. President Obama has fundamentally disagreed with Prime Minister Netanyahu on two main issues: the Iran nuclear deal and the prospects why a peace agreement with the Palestinians would be in Israel's security interest. Okay, yet at the same time, despite those disagreements, he has maintained support for Israel and its broader security needs. And despite all of Netanyahu's antics, right? Going way out there, further than any Israeli prime minister ever did. They, you know, about American politics on the support for Governor Romney in 2012, you know, campaigning in Congress against the nuclear deal. So I think that the criticisms really miss the point. They equate disagreeing with those issues. And as far as those issues are concerned, you know, I recommend you watch a documentary, you may have seen it on Netflix, called The Gatekeepers. It's interviews with 6 of the 7 living heads of the Israeli Mossad and Shin Bet, you know, the big security force. All of them have been of the view that peace with the Palestinians is in the Israeli national security interest. These are not doves, you know. You know, with all due respect, you know, Shimon Peres, who's a wonderful person, enormously important in the whole life of the state of Israel, was often seen as too much of a dove. These are hard-headed people that know it, right? And they can, and there's another series that's out now called The Commander. So there've been a lot of articles written on this. So there are many Israelis who really believe, you know, that Netanyahu is taking positions that are more in his political interests than in Israel's fundamental security interests. Okay, and so to the extent that President Obama shares that view, he's not alone in terms of Israelis, and there's a basis for it that's not just his own personal view. I think Secretary Clinton is really well positioned to handle this issue. She has a lot of credibility with the American Jewish community. She has credibility with Netanyahu. I know for a fact, including from when I was in the State Department in 2010, a particular set of phone calls between her and Netanyahu that were pretty tough, her on him, for things Netanyahu was doing in that first 2-year period. And you know, the Jewish American community, maybe true in Canada and Europe, is very split on these issues. You know, there's the so-called AIPAC position, but you know, whether it's the youth or others, I mean, Obama still got over 70% of the vote of the Jewish American community. He didn't get the 80s, but he still got over 70%. So I actually think that, you know, that there's plenty there for her to work with, and that Netanyahu, in his own way, is starting to tread on some thinner ice than he's been treading on at home.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, I'm a first-year student at the University of Ottawa, and my question is, in what ways do you think the Republican Party can rebrand itself to generate a higher youth and general vote?
So they'll have to nominate candidates other than Donald Trump. And so I don't think that kind of candidate is the future of the Republican Party. I think actually he's somewhat sui generis, that when we analyze what happened in 2015, 2016, we'll see that Bruce's analysis, which made it seem like this is a very Republican thing, and he's just a slightly caricatured version of a real Republican. More or less the way that the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man was, you know, just an extreme version of that from Ghostbusters. I don't think that that's accurate, and I think that he was able to win in 2015 for a number of because of a number of tactical blunders that other campaigns made, and because he had unique abilities to command TV and command public attention that wouldn't be replicated. So I worry less about the future of the Republican Party as if it were going to be nominating a series of these kind of candidates. The Trump-like candidates in primaries that were trying to follow in that pattern in the undercard, by and large, lost. So they lost for House, lost for Senate. The Trumpkins, they were called, they did not perform well. So I think he is one of a kind. That's the good news for the Republican Party. Now, from a positive point of view, what does the Republican Party have to do? Well, they have to go beyond the party of no, and I think this is where General Bruce's critique of the party is so extreme that they're willing to put in jeopardy the full faith and confidence in the credit rating of the United States government, or shut down the government, threatening that repeatedly. That's not a path to future electoral success. That the Republicans that I think have a better grip on it are called reformicons. And if you haven't read about it, Google that phrase, reformicons. And these are relatively conservative Republicans who have identified a series of policy reforms, some of which are so sensible even Bruce would endorse them, and others might be too free market or in orientation for Democrats, but are the type that would appeal to a younger generation that recognize that the old way of doing business is not likely to be a good deal for their generation in the long run. And so I think that there's potential for the Republican Party to grab the hearts and minds of a younger generation, but they have to get past this election, and they have to demonstrate in the next political season, whatever that looks like, that they can govern responsibly and produce results. And so I'm optimistic that they would do that. I realize this is like saying, aside from that, Mrs. Lincoln, what did you think of the play?
Right.
If you set aside Trump for a moment and just do a snapshot of the American political system, you would not conclude that it's the Republican Party that is the most in distress. Republicans have strength in the state chambers, so they control more governors, they control more state assemblies. Moreover, if you look at who were the two candidates that were vying for the power in the Democratic side, 68 years old, 72 years old, throwbacks to a very older generation, and younger than them, very, very thin bench. Very few Democratic leaders that command sort of a national stage and give you the sense that they could lead. So you would, aside from Trump, you would say, that's the Republican Party is a party that has some life in it, which is one of the reasons why, in answer to the earlier question, I think it's worth still saving this party. I realize that maybe the party can't be saved, but I think it's worth trying because there's a lot of value there.
I'll just add one thing to it, stop being climate change deniers. I think the youth, you may have a different view about how to deal with it. I mean, even the American business, the international business community, if you're an insurance company and you insure hotels on Miami Beach, your views are starting to change about this thing. And I think the denial of it, the way it's done, I think turns off a lot of youth who might have a policy answer that's different than what Democrats are. But I think that's a bigger thing with the younger generation than others.
Okay, we're running down to the wire here, and I see we have 2 questions left, so we'll try to make these relatively quick, if you don't mind. Please.
Okay, my name is Miguel Diaz. I'm a third-year student from the University of Ottawa. My question is related to Cuba. We have seen that during the Obama administration, we have experienced a defrost in American-Cuban relations, especially since the appointment of the new American ambassador in Havana. And my question is, how will the elections change this defrost process according to the different results, especially since Florida is one of the most important states during this election, again. And the Cuban-American community there has lots of power. So what will be the outcome for the Cuban-American relations?
Why don't you do your critique first?
Yes, well, I actually don't think the election will change much. Trump has not talked about reneging on that deal, so even if he wins, that's one area where I don't think you would see much change in policy. And of course, President Clinton would continue. And in some sense, this is a boil that's been lanced. This is done, and it's very hard to walk back. You can still choose to call the deal what it was, which was not much of a good deal from the U.S. point of view. It may have been time to move beyond the policies of sanction, but we should have gotten something more for it. Pretty much everything that the administration claimed that it got was found to be wanting in the months afterwards. And so as deals go, this illustrates Trump's critique of the administration, that they make bad deals. You can always get a deal if you make concessions. And that's what President Obama did on Cuba, got very little for it, but now it's done. And I think no matter who's president, it's going to be moving forward beyond that.
So 3 points. One on the politics. In 2012, Obama split the Cuban-American vote in Florida, and the demographics, he won in the younger vote. You know, younger Cuban-Americans didn't have any sympathy for the Castros, but they thought it was time to start having relations, you know, cultural exchanges, a little bit more travel, and the like. So the notion of this block of Cuban-Americans having one point of view has changed with demographic change, right? And I think that was, the election was before the deal, right? Politics. Second, policy. You know, there's a really interesting question here about what you get on deals, and the notion that he got a bad deal. First of all, the notion that if we somehow negotiated harder, kept the sanctions for another decade after, 50 plus years, that we were going to get the Cubans to fundamentally, cry uncle, cry tío, it just doesn't happen. That's not the way negotiations work, And I think the calculation here was we were more likely to have a positive effect over time with Cuba by opening relations, by stopping all the Canadian companies from getting all the good land for hotels and getting Americans in there, and with the overall effect, and that you have to work that process. And again, political science and other studies show that this is the way political change works. It doesn't happen, all right, you're right, I cry uncle, we're going to have free elections next week. There's not. So I think it's a strategic. This is one where Derek's playing the long game. I agree with that. Others I don't. I think you're making an event. Last point is the true story of the Cuban deal. So I was there in November 2012. I took a group of Duke alumni there, and just to be there. And I actually had some side meetings with some Cubans about some issues where they'd say, meet me at can't come to your hotel, meet me at such a fountain. And I ran into a bunch of guys from Massachusetts who were a softball team, guys my age. And they signed me up and went out and we played softball with a bunch of Cubans all day. And just like ping pong diplomacy helped with China back in 1971, our softball diplomacy was the crucial change that opened the way for Obama to do anything. And I got my T-shirt and I put it in Twitter and everything out there. So.
Thank you.
Okay, and the last question.
My name is Joshua Din. I'm a third-year fine student at the University of Ottawa. And having noted Trump's rhetoric on China and America's alliance with South Korea and Japan, I'm curious to hear about your opinions regarding what are the consequences for the South China Sea if Trump does win the presidency.
Well, I can advertise a great talk on the South China Sea later on today at 3 o'clock. So come hear Professor David Welch on that topic. This is one area where the inherent powers of the presidency would empower President Trump to take some pretty fateful steps. So one of the things he could do is declare that China is a currency manipulator, and that would trigger a number of punitive and then likely retaliatory steps and trigger a trade war. And he could do that, and there'd be very little Congress or other branches could do to stop him. And so it is possible for President Trump to have a big impact on China policy. Likewise, it's easy to imagine a incident at sea somewhere, some sort of ships running into each other or airplanes being downed. That happened to the Bush administration in 2001. And a real crisis early on in the watch in that area with all of the escalation dynamics that a crisis like that has. And then questions about temperament, questions about who is advising him and who he's listening to. All of those things could matter. The last thing I'd say is one of the things that America will have to do after this election is to reassure our allies and partners around the world that they can trust the United States, that the United States, when they make a deal with the United States, when the United States makes a commitment, the U.S. will back that up. I think there are serious doubts about that, even now under President Obama. I think many of our allies and partners feel that President Obama has let them down. And then they hear the rhetoric from the campaign and they worry even more. And I thought the best moment, and I'll end with a happy bouquet for Secretary Clinton, her best moment in the entire debate was when she pointedly said that she reassured the Japanese government and the South Korean government that America would honor its obligations. And I think that message will need to go forward in the next administration.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I think that that message was particularly, you know, with our allies, we send a message both of reassurance and restraint. You know, in Japanese politics, there have been certain incentives for them to be pretty nationalist and assertive towards China. And so we want to reassure our allies that we stand with them, but we don't give them blank checks so they draw us into things that may be in their interest and not ours. I think Peter's point about the incidents at sea, you know, so many things, conflicts over history, happen somewhat unintentionally, and that's a very dangerous situation there now. And I think that our strategy, I think we've been, you know, demonstrating, you know, sort of a coercive element a bit more under Secretary of Defense Carter. But ultimately, I think this is a negotiation strategy. I think you can work with the case that came out of The Hague. I think the efforts of ASEAN to develop a code of conduct, which China's rejected so far. But, you know, you work on those and you try to combine the elements of, you know, a certain amount of deterrence with a certain amount of diplomacy. I think that's where the solution is. I don't think it's in somehow ratcheting up your threats to China so much that you raise the risks. And frankly, allies like Australia would say that's not what we want either. So there's a balance here. I think Trump is totally incapable of anything that would fit under the word balance, you know. So I think this fits there too.
Okay, thank you. And thank you guys for a terrific conversation. This has been amazing, and I hope you got as much out of it as I did. We really appreciate your being here. Thank you very much. And special thanks also to the Center for International Policy Studies. We really appreciate their hosting this. And I think there's one more step before you get off the stage. They have a little something for you. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. It is my sad duty to conclude this event. I know we have more questions, but unfortunately we are out of time. So I would like to join Dick in thanking our panelists. It's been a tremendous event. I know I speak for everyone when I say we are even more passionate and more fascinated with the US race. Now, I was very sad to hear that you're not interested in the real estate market in our beautiful city.
Time may come.
But who knows, we'll ask you again after November. We do, however, hope to persuade you to come back at some point before too long and share your thoughts on the outcome of the election. And because we want you to have warm feelings when you think about Canada and Canadians, we do have a small gift for you.
Lovely.
Oh, that's great. That's great. That's great.
So hopefully next time you go skiing, you'll feel just a little bit Canadian.
Thank you.
But once again, thank you all so much. Thank you to the American Embassy. Thank you to Fulbright Canada. Thank you all for being here with us today. And please join me once again in thanking our panelists for a wonderful event.